Hallo und willkommen. Sustain OSS podcast, the podcast where we talk about sustaining open source for the long haul. Who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? Is it sustain or nach sustain? I don't really speak German, and I will not speak German during this podcast because I am an English speaker. I'm, of course, Richard Littauer, your main host today. Not really joined by any other co-host. If you would like to be a co-host, or would you like to find my other co-hosts, track them down, and tell them that they should be on this podcast, you are free to do so. Please do. But I am joined by a guest, and I'm very excited to talk to my guest today. I'm joined by Gina Häußge, calling in today from Frankfurt, or in the Nah von Frankfurt, as they say in Germany, which I think is just a delightful phrase. Gina is the creator and maintainer of OctoPrint, which we are going to talk about today. Gina, how you doing?
Hi, good morning. Yeah, I'm doing fine. Thank you for asking.
Gina, you're a passionate code monkey, gamer, and a bouldering apprentice. These are all your own words, by the way. And a creator and maintainer of OctoPrint. You can find it at octoprint.org, which we will get to in a second. But Gina's always been in love with code, loves tinkering, loves helping others, written open source for most of her life, which is awesome. And has been in a lucky position to do it full time recently because of crowdfunding for OctoPrint, which is my favorite type of open source project where you just do something, you do it really well, and other people are like, yeah, I want to pay money for that too. You have a heavy bag in your office, apparently, and you use it to combat the downsides of being a full-time open source developer. So I have two major questions. First, one, why is it a heavy bag and why not like something else? And two, what is OctoPrint?
I think I'm going to start with the first question. So being an open source maintainer sadly also means sometimes having to interact with quite entitled and rude and aggressive people. And I noticed in myself that I have a quite intense fight or flight response with regards to that. I lean towards the fight a lot.
Yep.
And so I got very, very angry whenever I encountered people like that in my day-to-day. And I solved that by simply putting a heavy bag in my office. So when I now get one of these very rude emails, one of these very aggressive tickets or something like that, then I just put on the Doom soundtrack or something like that, put on the gloves and go to town on the bag for a bit. And after that, then I can reply in a professional and not emotionless. I still make my boundaries clear and everything, but I'm not that close to screaming my head off at people anymore. So that really helps to break.
You are not the first developer I've heard of who has done this. It is, I think, actually probably common response to maintaining open source software. And I love it. That is awesome. Thank you so much.
Not many people actually put a heavy bag into their office, though. So
that is true.
At some point, I managed to actually capture a perfectly looping GIF of myself on that thing. And that is also now something that I have in the back of my hand in case of sick-headed people to just tell them, hey, by the way, this was me just now.
Okay, so it sounds like your project causes a lot of emotions. What does your project do?
OctoPrint is basically the snappy web interface for 3D printers. And what it does is, if you know cups, like a printer host, for paper printers, and OctoPrint is the same basically for 3D printers. So you have a website through which you can fully control your 3D printer, can upload jobs, can monitor jobs. You have a webcam integration on hand. So if you have added a webcam to your setup, you can actually see the printer do its thing. You can monitor the temperatures and the progress and everything. And if something goes wrong, which with 3D printers it often still will, you can intervene and cancel everything from remote. And there's also a plugin system in there that allows you to expand the functionality in various directions. And we have an official plugin repository. And the community now, all in all, has gotten together something like 350 plugins with various functionality built in that you can plug into OctoPrint and further enhance things like detecting if the print goes wrong based on image analysis, sending you an email when it is done or when the filament needs to be swapped, or keeping you posted about the status on Discord with regular snapshots from the webcam and stuff like that. Automation like turn on the lights if the print is done, or control this LED stripe with the progress or something like this. So there is a lot of stuff that people build, sometimes so creative that I cannot even recognize OctoPrint anymore underneath. Like there is a company in Munich who has put completely different web interface on top of OctoPrint to turn it into a controller for the laser cutter, which I have sitting here behind me as well as a test thingy. And someone in Hamburg, I think it was, even managed to turn OctoPrint into a controller for their custom-built pick-and-place machine. So there is a lot of creativity in there, and I love how this little pet project of mine that I created back in 2012, in late 2012, turned into a whole platform and ecosystem over the years and had so many people inspired to build awesome stuff on top of.
There's a special word that people often use called passive, meaning the passive voice, which is when you make, someone was kissed. And it's interesting because it's not really passive. It's actually just another way of changing the agent. And you just did the same thing with the community. This little project turned into a community, which implies that there was no agentship on your part. But it sounds like you were originally the BDFL, and now you're talking about many, many Germans with lasers. So tell me about your governance. How did you end up with a large, healthy community without completely burning out?
I honestly don't know. I happen to actually still be the BDFL, and I'm also mostly the sole maintainer. And for the main application itself, I'm also more or less the sole developer still. And that is the point where I have no idea how I even do it sometimes. But the way that I approached everything with OctoPrint so far was basically just by gut feeling. Like, OctoPrint is something that I use myself with my 3D printer. So all of this happened because in late 2012, I got myself my first 3D printer. It was sitting here in my office. It was producing noises. It was producing fumes. And I found it very annoying that it had to be tethered to my back then still Windows PC for the whole time. I couldn't play games while it was running. And then whenever a Windows update came in, the print was ruined. So that was something that really tickled me the wrong way. And yeah, my day job back then was also a bit boring. So I was in desperate need of a pet project. And so I said those famous last words, how hard can it be? And went to work over my Christmas vacation back then and created what is now OctoPrint. And back then was just a very cruddy web interface thrown inside Cura of all things, which is actually another tool that's part of the usual 3D printer workflow, where you first have to you have a 3D model, then you have to slice it into layers, and those layers then get sent to the printer to be printed. And this Cura tool also had a little thing that was able to talk to the printer and do this whole job sending bit. And this is basically where I hooked in and put my web interface on top. And later then I extracted it from Cura and turned it into its own thing. But this is how things started. And since then, I've basically just been trying to build it into something that I enjoy using, that I can imagine enables other people to build on it, that is as easy to use as I can make such a complicated process without cutting corners with regards to control, with regards to customization abilities, and also safety and such. And yeah, that's basically how I approach these things. And I've come close to burnout a bunch of times. That's never fun, but so far I've been able to hold it back with aggressively fighting for my time off the project, for my vacations, for my after hours. And I've also reduced, I went full-time with OctoPrint now actually 10 years ago. First employed by a 3D printing / technology company. And then when they ran out of money in 2016, I went to do this crowdfunded. And for 2 or 3 years now, I've actually dialed it back to 4 days a week because I noticed that my physical health was actually suffering from all the workload, way too often sick. I noticed that 2 days of the weekend really did not do much anymore in recharging the batteries at all. So I was just on a constant downward spiral energy-wise. And so I did this experiment back in early 2022, I think, where I said, okay, for 2 months now, I'm going to try to see how do I impact my productivity if I just work from Monday to Thursday? And does it do anything with regards to how I feel, how my health works and such? And the result was I was pretty much doing the same amount of work, but I was feeling way better. I wasn't that burned out anymore. So I figured, okay, 4-day work week it is.
Amazing. I'm a huge fan of the 4-day work week. I never manage it, but I'm a huge fan of the idea. It's really good to hear that it worked for you as a maintainer. It's also worked really well for everyone who uses OctoPrint. OctoPrint's one of the few tools that have come up multiple times in spotlights or just in conversation on this podcast. Eric Berry was a huge fan of it. Tom Spot Calloway, huge fan of it. Martin Woodward at GitHub used it, I believe, if I'm reading the notes correctly. So it's really, really awesome to see that it's made a lot of people very, very happy. You're happy working, so therefore they're happy getting the cool products. Like, it works out for everyone. When I was talking about governance earlier, one of the questions I have in my head is that you mentioned this huge environment of apps, of additional add-ons, 350 different plugins that you can use. As a core maintainer of the central piece of the code, you have to take some considerations into account in order to enable an app ecosystem. And you also have to hold on to good relations to at least some of the developers who are managing those other plugins. Otherwise, that whole ecosystem will fall apart. Can you tell me about what their buy-in is? How have you managed to coordinate with the plugin developers? And how do you set boundaries around what they demand of you from OctoPrint?
So in general, my approach has been to keep the API as stable as possible, because the worst thing that you can force your plugin developers through is, with every single version update, having to also push out an update on their end in order to keep things working with the current version of OctoPrint. And a ton of the plugin authors that create plugins for OctoPrint actually are self-taught people, not programmer professionals or something like that, or at least not in this specific language, and they are hobby maintainers. So I really do not want to force them into a situation where they cannot keep up with things anymore and have to constantly jump through hoops in order to keep their stuff working. I saw that with other projects, and I always found this very off-putting when considering whether I wanted to contribute time to such a project. Because if it's just like a pet project, if it's just something that you wrote to scratch your own itch, the last thing that you want to do is dedicate your weekends for the next few years in order to keep it running. And so I try to just keep stuff stable as possible there. I stick to semantic versioning on the APIs. I document changes a ton. When I have to do the step of changing how things work internally in undocumented part of OctoPrint, where I know that people still rely on them. So something that would not fall onto semantic versioning itself, but could still interrupt things, then I try to, first of all, put deprecation notices in there, put fallback layers in there, so that if accesses a renamed internal variable, they get a little warning in the log so that they or someone using their plugins will see that, hopefully, and they get a heads up early enough. And then some versions later, when I remove or make this change permanent, then I also do my best to mention that again in the changelog. I have a blog for the project where I put early warnings for really disruptive changes. For example, OctoPrint is written in Python. When I started, Python 3 was out back then as well, but everything that you still found about Python was more like pointing to Python 2 still. And so I made the mistake in hindsight to also go with Python 2 for OctoPrint. And then when that was deemed end of life in 2020, from 2019 onwards, I had to do this whole big rewrite to make OctoPrint compatible with Python 3. And thankfully, I had a lot of help from external contributors with that as well. And then in, I think, 2021 or something, I made OctoPrint fully Python 3 only. And that was a point where I had to put out a lot of communication in before. And I mentioned it in my monthly video devlogs. I put it out on the forums. I put it out on the blog, and every blog post automatically also triggers an announcement inside OctoPrint instances as well that there is a new blog post. So that hopefully also reached people there to tell them that in order to not be left behind on an ancient OctoPrint version, they would need to upgrade their environment to Python 3. And this is something that I will now have to do again soon, because a lot of people are still on Python 3.7, which is end of life since last, I think, September or something like that. And I see that plenty of them are still on that. So this is something that I constantly have to do.
So speaking of the constantly have to do, OctoPrint on Air, your blog is amazing. But if you also go to the website, you can see that you have a Mastodon, you have an IRC, you have a Discourse, you have all these different things. Are you the only person who's paid from crowdfunding, or do you have like a team under you doing marketing?
No.
You're the only person. How do you manage your time? Like, how do you hold all the community? Do you have a lot of volunteers who help out with
I
management
thankfully
day-to-day?
now have a lot of community volunteers who help with, especially with the forums and with the Discord, because those are the two
Amazing.
major traffic vectors, so to speak. And that works very well. It was important for me to actually have a dedicated community forum. A lot of projects these days are leaning towards Discord as the only means of communication, as the only means of documentation, which I find very, very wrong. For the longest time, I also tried to resist the adoption of a Discord because I already had an IRC channel. And I figured that if people wanted to do real-time chat, then they could use the IRC channel, open protocol, open source, perfect match, and all that. But people really were like, please give us a Discord. And then when the pandemic hit, I was, okay, maybe that's a good idea to allow people to have another place to hang out. And so I created Discord. But we have a bridge between Discord and IRC. So in the Discord, we have an IRC channel and you can join that and then actually also interact with the people on the IRC channel. And I have to say that the adoption rate for the Discord was so much better than ever for the IRC channel. So people really apparently wanted that. But I make it a point to put any kind of things that should be searchable, that should be guideposts or something like that on the forums where they can be indexed, where they can be searched, where they can be found online and are not hidden behind some proprietary walls.
Speaking of proprietary walls, I'm looking at your GitHub, which is just, I love this project just for the way it looks. It's like maximizing, like, here, you can pay me here, here, and here, and here. You can contact me here, 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 and here. Here's what we're doing here. It's just so much information all at once that makes it's just really exciting because it's really alive. One of the things I'm noticing that's different is in your long list of full caps.md files, right? Authors, changelog, code of conduct, contributing license, manifest, readme, security, supporters. Third-party licenses is one I have never seen before. So this is third-party licenses, all one word, .md. Tell me about this file.
Yeah, I figured I would just have to have some place where I actually document what I am building upon and what it is licensed as. That was also a bit to ensure for myself that I was not doing any license breaching, because OctoPrint is AGPL3, because the Cura thing that I based my work on that I mentioned earlier was AGPL3, so I inherited that basically. And to be frank, I also still consider it a good idea for something that is accessed through a network if you want to make sure that any forks also have to stay open source, but I digress. So on one side, it was for me to make sure that I was not in violation of any licenses there. It was to give credit to stuff that I built. And this is also something that, so this whole third-party licenses MD file actually gets pulled into OctoPrint builds. And if you go into OctoPrint's About dialog, there will be a tab in there that says third-party licenses, so you can see that there as well. The same holds true for supporters MD, for authors MD, so all of that actually gets pulled into OctoPrint's About dialog. In the same About dialog, I also built a dynamic list of all of the installed plugins with their license information as well, so that you can see what you have installed, what license does it have. There's also Plugin Manager that also gives you all of this information, but the About dialog also gets it.
So there's a huge level of abstraction, which you've just made very, very simple and made it clear to people, hey, this is what I'm doing. This is what I'm building my work off of. Here's where you can reach me. You don't look to me like a corporation-shaped object. You're not Red Hat. You're not Google. You're not Microsoft. You're not some large German auto manufacturer. So the question for me is, why bother with third-party licenses? Because you're not going to sue anyone that I know of who's going to misuse your code. And it's unlikely that someone's going to sue you for breaching your license thing. So like, why this file?
It boils down to feeling like the right thing to do, to just mention what I use. That's one of these gut feeling thingies, because it is not much work for me to keep this thing updated. Just when I add a dependency, I throw it in there. When I remove a dependency, I throw it out of there, and that's it. And I think maybe it also has helped people to decide whether they are capable of contributing to OctoPrint, because they can go through that and see this is the technology stack that this is basically built upon. So,
can you tell me a time where your gut feeling failed?
Architectural decisions throughout the lifespan of OctoPrint, like when I didn't know anything better, basically. In hindsight, I really wish I had built the whole server infrastructure differently, because currently everything is like, there is an async layer in front of a not async layer, of a synchronous layer, and that is causing a havoc with regards to potential speed and performance that can be reached. And I worked around this in the latest version a bit more by adding yet another layer in the middle that threads the synchronous layer. But if I were doing things from the bottom up again, then I would definitely change a lot of decisions that I made. Of course, being at the center of the spider web, so to speak, of a huge plugin ecosystem, every single change like that, architectural changes, huge sweeping changes are something that I always have to keep well documented, well thought out in order to not impact that ecosystem too much. So that always involves having to put in compatibility layers, documenting everything well, having fallbacks in place so that not everything breaks when someone installs a plugin from 2 years ago and such like that, things like that. So a plug-in system like OctoPrint is both a feature and a curse. On one hand, I can tell people who make demands of me, hey, OctoPrint should also have that feature and OctoPrint should also have that feature. I can just tell them, hey, awesome idea. I do not have the hardware or not the setup to test this specifically, but apparently it sounds like you do. So maybe just write a plugin. Here's the plugin documentation. Here's the plugin tutorial. Go hog wild, have fun, and then continue to maintain that. Thank you. On the other hand, I have this constant backwards compatibility stuff that I have to keep in mind and where I have basically painted myself into the corner in the one or other side in OctoPrint. For example, the UI is still based on technology from 12 years ago now. And swapping that out, people are constantly like, oh, when will there be a new UI? Can you not build something with React? Can you not build something with Vue.js or something? Like, yeah, of course I can, but then all the plugins stop working. So the biggest challenge with revamping the UI, which is something that I've been going on and off for the past 2 or 3 years now, actually, and built several prototypes and even built a whole new plugin hook that allows you to swap the web interface based on requests and such so that we could keep the old version while working towards compatibility of all plugins with a newer version, is that modern JavaScript doesn't really make it easy anymore to just pull in bits of the page post compile time. And so it is a nightmare and it's a big project all in its own.
So I like your response. Architectural decisions don't work for gut feeling, because it's accurate, right? You have to know a lot and you have to have a lot of technical knowledge happening in your head. But you started this conversation, or I started it for you, by mentioning a punching bag and by mentioning, what do you do when you need to off-gas some emotion before responding? And humans don't naturally enter the world understanding their responses and understanding their emotions. And so our gut feeling often fails us when we're learning how to deal with other people. Now, if you're enlightened and you figure all this out, that's great. But one of my questions for you is, as a core maintainer who has to ask people for money, people who you like, in order to crowdfund, and in order to deal with people who are entitled and want you to do stuff now for their plugin or now for their printing thing, your gut feeling may not always be accurate on the emotional stuff. And I'm really curious, when has it failed there and what have you had to learn? Another way of phrasing this question is, what's really difficult for you, say in the past 6 months, that you've had to get over in order to be a successful maintainer? Is there anything that's been really tough?
Yeah, plenty of things, but all of these were not gut feel related. So in general, where I actually have to go completely against my gut feeling is the whole asking for money bit, because that is something that I absolutely hate with every fiber of my being. But that was a lot of mental work to try to get myself to do that. So the thing is, I hate being in the spotlight. I hate promoting myself. I hate marketing myself. The thing, though, is I love doing this work. Like every job, it has its downsides. It has its costs, mentally and physically. But looking back at the early parts, at the early half of my career as a corporate drone, it is so much more wholesome. It is so much more like I feel like I'm actually making a difference. And so this is something that I really enjoy. And if I want to keep doing that, then I need funding. So I just try to win against my brain there by going like, yeah, you absolutely hate that, but this is just like doing your taxes and cleaning the carpet and stuff like that. That's just something that you have to do no matter how much you hate it. And so I started very softly, like actually the aforementioned about dialogue was one of the first things that I put in OctoPrint in order to hint at its funding. situation when I had to go full-time crowdfunded with it. Then I started sprinkling in, and by the way, every single release before it, this OctoPrint version has been on release notes. And then last year, somewhere around this time, actually, I ran into the problem that I had seen my income steadily decline over the past 2 years or something like that. And it had gotten to a point where I was really thinking, so, okay, I mean, it was not yet at a critical point, but the trend was worrying. And so I put out a post and basically explained to people, if this continues like it does now, then I really have to think about if I can actually continue to do that. I communicated my feelings about things. I also I hope I made it very transparent that this was not like this either goes up or I stop and drop the hammer immediately or something like that. It was more like, by the way, we have a worrying trend here and we have to think about whether things are still working out like that in the future if this trend continues. And the response to that was like the biggest spike in additional funds that I ever saw, even like compared to the initial crowdfunding start. It was a huge outpour of support, but I also got a lot of feedback from people that they didn't even know that OctoPrint was basically a one-woman show and that it was crowdfunded. And that was the point where I sat down and was like, okay, I thought it was communicating this quite aggressively, but apparently I wasn't. And I really have to think about how to make things even more transparent, as much as I hate it. So I put a funding banner now on every single release announcement, on the releases on GitHub. I mentioned it more aggressively in every single release note on the blog as well. I put a banner inside the About dialog in OctoPrint itself. And I also did something that was surprisingly a lot of fun. I figured, how do I tell people that they can help fund the development on OctoPrint at a point where they have actually gotten value from it the most? So I figured something like count the successfully completed print jobs or something. And if so, then just show a little notification. And by the way, you can fund that. But I figured that is a bit boring and a bit on the nose. So instead, I built in an achievement system. So you now have a bunch of, in my humble opinion, quite fun achievements. There's also some hidden ones that people are still discovering. And it gives me a ton of joy when someone posts a screenshot on the Discord or in the community forum with one of these. And I'm like, yeah, someone found it. And some of the positive ones of these also now get a little additional footer, like enjoying OctoPrint, you can help fund its development here. So it is basically a little gimmick, but people can also disable if they don't want to have it. That's also something that is very important to me, to give people control over what bits of OctoPrint they use and what not, which is also why a ton of new functionality gets implemented as plugins. Plugins can always be disabled. And so this achievement system was also built as a plugin. And at the same time, it also acts as a little shout out when something awesome happens. Like, congratulations, now you have now printed for 404 hours cumulatively. Don't you maybe want to give me money? Thank you.
I love that. I think it's a really good idea. I'm sorry, I'm just running with it for things that I need to do elsewhere in other parts of my life. And I'm just like, well, I could probably build that. That would be good. And then I could.
Word of warning, though, I've gotten a surprising amount of
hate mail.
Yeah, actually, like, do we have to gamify everything? What for? And I'm like, for this reason, for this reason, for this reason. And by the way, you can disable it. But this was another case where the heavy backs saw some use just because of the tone of like. I understand that not everyone wants to have that, which is why I built it, so that you can just disable it. So there's no reason to scream your head off at me for building that, you know?
Yeah.
And it was
I love that.
fun to build. Like, it was legit one of the most fun bits of my job for the past year or so, building this achievement plugin, because I just sat down with two friends who also use OctoPrint, trying to figure out what could be some fun achievements to put in there. And then I built the code to detect that stuff and also all the infrastructure to build that, and decided on some icons for those. And so there's a little thing that comes with a poop emoji. So that is one that people most often screenshot when they get it. Usually makes them laugh when something is going really wrong. So
where can I find this plugin?
It's built into the current versions. So if you install a current version of OctoPrint, it will also come pre-enabled. Unless you intentionally disable it, you will have achievements.
Which you can always do. Gina, this is amazing. I'm really enjoying this conversation, and it makes me so sad that I have to basically put a close to it because we're running up on time and we have other stuff to do in our lives. So OctoPrint can be found on github.com/OctoPrint. That's with a C, not a K. No one here uses Greek. Why would you spell it with a K? OctoPrint.org is where you can find it online. And of course, you can find Foosel, as Gina is called, Foosel, in all the places and all the things. Any other links I should have put there?
Maybe foosel.net. That would be like the main page of mine, where you can also find the links to all of the other things. Like I have a Mastodon account.
Foosel.net. And of course, you can support this work by going to octoprint.org, and there's a giant banner right at the top. It is hard to miss. And so there you go. And you can find it, and you can support Gina and help her continue to make these things. You said earlier you don't like being in the spotlight. That's okay. This is the part of the show called Spotlight, where we highlight other people, projects, or things, and it doesn't have to be you. I've done this before, but I'm going to do it again. Eric Berry pointed out that we should really have you on back in 2020. So Eric finally fulfilling that promise to get Gina on this podcast. Eric was one of the main co-hosts and just an all-around excellent human. Great Ruby developer. If you need one, I think hire him. So shout out to Eric Berry for being who you are. Gina Häußge, what's yours today?
Yeah, it took me a while to figure something out to put here because there's so much to put here, basically, from my end. But I finally actually decided on the Advanced Bash Scripting Guide by Mendel Cooper. That sounds a bit weird, maybe, but this is like this huge book-length thing. It calls itself the in-depth exploration of the out-of-shell scripting. And around 20 years ago, I was starting on working with Linux and wrapping my head around all of this stuff. This is what I actually physically printed out and took with me whenever I was on public transport or so to university and back and read through back to back. And this jump-started, I think, my whole system administration bit of my career. Pretty much. I've automated so much throughout the years based on the knowledge that I gained from this book. It's completely free. It's public domain. And I still quite often refer to it whenever I have to write something new and have forgotten some of the sometimes quite weird syntax of, for example, matching substrings or something like that. So yeah, the Advanced Bash Scripting Guide.
Not the first person on this podcast to say that all the work is really just bash scripts.
If I do have to do something quick and dirty, then more often than not, it's still bash scripting and one-liners and such.
Speaking of quick and dirty things that you can do, listeners, you can go on opencollective.com/sustainoss and you can donate to this podcast if you've enjoyed it. I never like doing that, but it'd be great if we could have more money so we could fund this sort of work. Other things you could do is you could tell people about it. Tell people about OctoPrint. Go out and tell your friends, please use this thing. Please print some stuff. Print them a little penguin and give it to them saying, this is the penguin. Richard told me to do it. And you should all use OctoPrint. You can also email podcast@sustainoss.org if you have any thoughts about this. You can find Gina on our show notes at podcast@sustainoss.org. Please send us notes and please go look at the show notes. Go out and check out OctoPrint and like this podcast wherever it is downloaded and sold. You can also go to our discourse at discourse@sustainoss.org. Gina, it's been really great talking to you. Thank you so much for taking the time today. I hope you don't need to go punch a punching bag after having this conversation. I hope that things are just okay with you and that you have a beautiful rest of your day. And good luck. Keep crowdfunding. I know it sucks, but you're doing a great job and you get to do other stuff with that time. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. And yeah, no heavy bag planned for today. So all is fine on that end.